Zetaman, host of the Neurotrition podcast. And I'm coming to you guys today for a little special response video that I wanted to go through. As most of you, I'm sure, have heard, Health and Human Services Secretary Robert F. Kennedy Jr. has made his announcements on some of the underlying causes of autism. And what they came forth was some research that showed that there was a potential association with Tylenol taken while during pregnancy. And there's been a lot of pushback to that thought. And the other one was, interestingly enough, a new treatment, a treatment that actually has been around for quite a while, but a treatment that seeks FDA approval, which would make it a lot more mainstream. And I want to take some time to break down both of those topics and also show there is some possible interconnectivity in between those two topics. So let's start off with the cause, the Tylenol potential association. Let's break down where that research came from. Okay, so first, the study. Now, this study was not just a study, it was actually a systemic review using the navigation guide methodology. So essentially, think of this as a way of studying the studies that have been done on this topic. So there was 46 overall studies that were done, and essentially 27 of those studies showed a positive association, meaning that there was a connection to Tylenol and an increase in autism diagnosis. The other studies, we had 4 that indicated negative results or negative association, which means potentially a protective a result, and indicating that it would actually perhaps prevent autism diagnoses. And there was 9 other studies that showed no association at all. So essentially, you had 27 of the studies showing a positive association and 13 that didn't. So definitely, if you look at this from that aspect, the majority of the research did show a positive association. And what's more, that the authors of the study indicated that the higher quality of the study actually showed more association than the lower quality studies that did not show association. So now, does this prove that autism is caused by Tylenol? Absolutely not. It does not prove that at all. It does show a lot of smoke, and I think that it is not a bad thing to start letting people be aware of this potential harm and looking at potential alternatives. Now, what's the downside of this? Now, for instance, during pregnancy, there is limited options for anti-inflammatory use. One of the big criticisms that I've seen since this all came out was, what about fevers? When we have high fevers, that can create issues with development as well, especially early on, can cause some neural tube defects. Well, this is when people have to talk to their doctor. Now, what was said yesterday, that Tylenol is not necessarily contraindicated during pregnancy because of this finding. It is just something that needs to be used more cautiously and only as absolutely needed. I don't think that's bad advice in general with medications during pregnancy. Let's talk a little bit more about where this study came from. It was conducted in conjunction with Mount Sinai, and one of the lead authors of this study actually is associated with Harvard. Okay, so looking at this press release from Harvard School of Public Health, this comment was from Andrea Baricelli, who is the Dean of Faculty at Harvard T.H. Chan School of Public Health and a professor of environmental health, was the senior author. And as they indicated, this was done using a navigation guide systemic review methodology, a gold standard framework for doing a systemic review. So this was not junk science. It was, definitely, it may not have had the result that a lot of people wanted to see as far as discrediting this theory, but it was a good study. It wasn't junk science, and it did look at. Now, it doesn't mean that I don't disagree. We want to keep looking at research. We need to keep looking at it because, for one, I want to be real clear. I don't think that there is one cause of autism. Okay, and then we're going to talk a little bit more about, even if we know that something caused abnormal neurodevelopment. That imbalance and connectivity within the brain is still going to need things to help wire it, even if we get rid of the inflammatory result that may have created the path to this abnormal development of the nervous system. There still isn't going to fix it just to remove it. Maybe we can help prevent some of the cases. That would be great, but that doesn't necessarily mean we don't have treatment that needs to happen. Anyway, this Dr. Baricelli, what she had to say on the results of this is exactly what I was saying. Further research is needed to confirm the association and determine causality, but based on existing evidence, I believe that caution about acetaminophen use during pregnancy, especially heavy or prolonged use, is warranted. On top of that, she said that again, what has been said during this whole time, it's not that we shouldn't use Tylenol at all. It can be used in the proper context for the proper amount of time. But based off this, the recommended judicious acetaminophen use, lowest effective dose, shortest duration, under medical guidance, tailored to individual risk benefit assessments rather than a broad limitation. So again, this is not saying it's contraindicated. NSAIDs are generally contraindicated in the second half of pregnancy. So there is a need for something to control out of control fevers, even though I would argue that sometimes we overtreat fevers, especially low grade fevers. Certainly fevers that get, in 103, 104, 105 need to be dealt with. But, a lot of times we're treating 100-degree fevers, and that is not necessary, and maybe suppresses some of the natural immune response because of that. But the point being is that this is just giving caution to people. So why is this an issue? Why is this potentially a problem when it comes to neurodevelopment? Well, most likely what the underlying mechanism here is that this is creating an oxidative stress. There's something most likely in what we call the epigenetics of the mother that allows her not to be able to process and go through the normal process of detoxification that creates an inflammatory response that then impacts neurodevelopment. That's very unlikely to happen on a singular dose, but under repeated prolonged dose, it's much, much more likely to be an issue. So let's dive into the next part of this announcement, which was leucovorin as a potential treatment for autism. Well, what is leucovorin? Now, I'm actually happy that this is coming to the forefront and potentially going to get FDA approval because it's an extremely safe intervention that could potentially help a lot of children and maybe have more, I'm hoping, give more access to this. It is folinic acid, which essentially is folate. A lot of you may know it as folic acid. What's ironic is that folic acid does not exist in nature. It is a man-made synthetic version of B9. When we get B9 through food, it is called folate. And folinic acid is just a more bioavailable version of it. When we ingest a nutrient, what people don't realize is, especially when they are synthetic nutrients, they have to go through a metabolic process to be broken down into a form that our cells can actually use it. So there's a couple of different things that can happen with everybody, not just children with neurodevelopmental disorders, but also with mothers who are maybe taking something like Tylenol or any other medication or anything else that could essentially need to be detoxed as a form of a toxin after it becomes metabolized. And those two things are, one thing, are epigenetics. So what are epigenetics? Epigenetics are essentially how our genes can be turned on and off due to exposure and interaction with our environment. Probably the most significant epigenetic structure we have, especially when it relates to folate, is going to be something called MTHFR. Now, there are other genetic markers with the process of called methylation. And if you want to know kind of like a simple version of what methylation is, it's essentially the chemical process and how our genes are turned on and turned off. And so this ends up affecting almost everything, how our DNA is replicated. And when you really think about the process of neurodevelopment, especially during pregnancy, is very essential that this process is running as smoothly as possible. And I think this is where we are getting a lot of the effects in utero that are starting to shift neurodevelopment off track. So when we look at MTHFR, we can see there's different mutations here. This is the test that we typically run. And you can have anywhere from a 20% reduction to a 70, 80% reduction of how you metabolize something like folic acid. And this is where things like folinic acid, methylfolate, different bioavailable versions of this can be very, very helpful. When you have this mutation, things like acetaminophen, for instance, can create more of what we call an oxidative stress. Just think of that as inflammation. And the more inflammation that there is over a prolonged period of time, especially when you're making a human, is more likely to create all kind of different effects, especially on the neurodevelopment side that is happening so rapidly during this time frame. The other thing that can happen, especially in autism, that we know, is there can be autoantibodies. So essentially, think of this as more of an autoimmune issue with the folate receptor, which means that folate is not being transported efficiently to the brain when development is rapidly happening. That's a little bit different of a situation. The treatment is kind of the same in both of these situations. But these are the two reasons why, one, acetaminophen might be a problem to begin with, but also a reason why leucorvin could be a potentially very helpful treatment to this. Now, just because that this may be part of the issue that's happening doesn't mean it's going to necessarily fix the situation. Well, let's just look at, for example, this quote from Dr. Robert Melillo, who is one of the leaders as far as research into treating autism, with some of the most cutting edge research out there. And he's, in full context, this is, what he does and how he trains practitioners is how we approach autism. And while we use things like functional medicine and certain supplementation, B9 folinic acid is definitely something that we use. And by the way, you don't need a prescription for that. You can, it's you got to find something that can be, upped into the dosage of the prescription level, but that certainly can be done. And it is something that can be helpful, that can help the neuroplasticity, the connection starting to be made. What Dr. Melillo talks about here is that this doesn't fix what's going on in the brain. Because even if you were, let's just, play this game out where we're saying, okay, we haven't had enough folinic acid. We had inflammation in utero. So now we have this imbalance in the connectivity of the brain. Well, just because you take that away or start to supplement and fill that gap doesn't mean the brain's going to automatically wire after that. You have to still fix the functional disconnectivity, the retained primitive reflexes, all of those imbalances, which takes neuroplasticity work. Now, you can oftentimes, and I've seen this happen in my own practice, is that you might get a kid young enough that you hit this early enough that this sets them in an emotion where they can start to catch up somewhat naturally by doing that. And that does happen. And I've seen it happen in my own practice. But for a vast majority of the cases, just doing this alone is not going to be enough to see significant changes where you want to be. All of it has to be factored in, but it is not, there is no magic bullet. Even Dr. Fry, who has used leucorvin to a lot of success, and a lot of his case studies have come out of this, even says this is not one magic bullet. But there is no treatment. There is no real official treatment out there for parents to start hanging their hat on to utilize. And this is safe. It is a vitamin. It's a water-soluble vitamin. It's going to be very hard to get this in a toxic level. I think it's very worthwhile to add this to the mix, just because it hasn't been proven beyond this, unbelievable bar. By the way, there's not a lot of people out there looking to do multi-million dollars of research on a nutrient. There's not as much profit in that as opposed to novel drugs. So this is all things to consider. You got to remember, and I'm one of these parents, not just a physician. There's a lot of parents desperate for things that can help. And the way I've always looked at it with my child is, hey, if this is not going to hurt him, and we can tell from the safety studies on folate that this is a very safe intervention. Why aren't we encouraging trying these types of things? This is not an expensive intervention whatsoever. So I think this has been good that we've had this debate. It's starting to have people talking about this, looking at this. My frustration, though, is that just like we had during COVID, we are seeing politicalization of this issue. And it seems like people are just taking sides based off political affiliation, which I don't think is productive. I also wish the messaging was a little bit better. I wish we could have talked a little bit more about, why this is acetaminophen. Let's tie these things together. I think it's very interrelated, this treatment, the epigenetics, why this is potential an issue, and that we should be looking for more, because there's most likely the mechanism underlying acetaminophen is going to be underlying potential other causes that are creating more challenges in neurodevelopment. Trust me, I would like to treat this less after the fact. So as much as we can do to help lower exposure to things that could be contributing, I'm all for it. And I think there is no harm and recommending a more judicious use of any medication whatsoever. And we should be hopefully going from that to, hey, let's think about talking to more parents about doing more in-depth family planning. Let's do epigenetic testing. Let's look at their genetic weaknesses. Because maybe person A doesn't have nearly the risk of acetaminophen use, for instance, than patient B. And that can give us a lot better context and some things we could be doing proactively, even before a family even gets to the point of, hey, I want to start having a kid. You've got this MTHFR, your folate metabolism reduced 60-70%. So let's go ahead and get ahead of this. Let's get you on these bioavailable B vitamins now, 6 months before you want to get pregnant. Let's look at inflammatory markers that, can tell us if there is inflammation due to this genetic mutation. Homocysteine is a very inexpensive blood test that could be run to look at these things. So I am glad this is coming to the forefront. I wish there was better messaging, to be honest with you. And I do wish there was more openness to look at things outside the box to help these kids, because, a lot of parents are kind of having to piece it together on their own and getting lots of pushback and not nearly as much help. So anyway, that's my 2 cents on what's going on, for what it's worth. I hope that brings some context to it and has people thinking a little bit differently about it. Please don't forget to like and subscribe the Neurotrition podcast, and please leave me a comment of what you thought about this. Good, bad, and different. I'm curious on what people think. And of course, if you want me to dig a little bit deeper into these issues on our future episodes, just let me know.